Good morning. It is Saturday or Sunday, December 17th, 2023. And yesterday, one of the biggest news stories in the church broke, and there's a lot to it that I don't think people are catching, and it's going to be worth talking about here. So, I'm going to let the clock run just a little bit before we start. Yes, blessed third Sunday of Advent to everyone, as Mary reminds us in the chat. It's Gaudete Sunday, Rose Sunday. Some of the most beautiful liturgical music of the year is going to be at your Mass today if you're attending a high Mass, or maybe in the ordinary form, as they used to call it. They'll offer some of the better liturgical music. Let me know later on if that's the case for you, or if you've already been to Mass, like Mary, who's in, I believe, Ireland. So, yes, and good morning to everyone from Ireland. Looks like I have the Irish checking in this morning. Very good to have you. Let us begin by talking about the story that broke yesterday. This is a story involving Cardinal Giovanni Angelo Becciu, which, for those of you who've been watching me for a long time, know that I covered this story in 2019 and 2020 when it initially broke. But then it's gotten kind of quiet as it went into its formal phase. And it broke midday yesterday on Saturday. And I think it's actually one of the most important stories of the year, at least, if not going past into the past several decades. Well, you wouldn't know it with how few of us, meaning in your podcasting community, are going to be talking about it. Because at the end of the day, the Vatican wants us to buy something. They want us to believe that the news that broke that allegedly takes care of a problem going back at least to the 1970s, and if you believe Malachi Martin, to the 1870s, really going back to the unification of Italy and the Papal States at that time, that this problem has suddenly been taken care of. You'll note that there's some odd coincidences here too, which I'm going to get into, because this is not, Cardinal Becciu should not be taken in isolation. But for now, let's start with just the story of the day, which is one that comes to us via Pillar Catholic, and they provide us with this headline. Oh, come on, where did it go? Of course. Sometimes get critiqued because I'm not ready, but then it's not that I'm not ready. It's that sometimes you click a button to make things happen and they just don't happen. Here's our headline from Pillar Catholic: Cardinal Becciu guilty. I like the Pillar because they're for a lot of good reasons, including their headlines being just very basic and to the point. Cardinal Becciu had been the latest in a long line of prelates who had been in charge of digging into the financial situation of Vatican City. Except it looks like when he started digging into that situation, he liked what he saw, decided to take advantage of it. The names of some of his predecessors in that role is going to raise a few eyebrows too, because it will suddenly make everything that's happened in some stranger stories from the past couple of years make a lot of sense. In fact, going back to the past decade. But let's first get to the core of the story here. Quote, the long-running Vatican finance trial ended Saturday with a guilty verdict for Cardinal Giovanni Angelo Becciu, along with convictions for several other former Vatican officials and businessmen who worked with the Vatican. Judge Giuseppe Pignatone read out the highly anticipated verdicts December 16th against 14 defendants, 10 individuals, and 4 companies, who faced 49 charges. The 10 individuals received the following verdicts according to the statement from the Tribunal of Vatican City. And I'm actually going to ignore most of the laity on this because we're focusing on the Cardinal here. But Cardinal Becciu, the former substitute or sostituto of the Secretariat of State, sort of like number 2 at the Secretary of State, basically, received a sentence of 5 years and 6 months, a fine of €8,000, around $8,700, and perpetual disqualification from holding public office. His lawyer said he would appeal the verdict. And then they go into the layman, which are immaterial here. They're not names you're going to know, and so it's not going to be important. The Vatican court also ordered the confiscation of more than 166 million euros, around $180 million, $1 million. Now, this is the Vatican court doing this. The defendants were sentenced jointly and severally to pay damages of more than 200 million euros, roughly $218 million, to the civil parties to the trial. The marathon trial featured 69 witness testimonies, 124,563 printed and electronic pages, and 2,479,062 files presented by the prosecution. The defense deposited more than 20,000 pages with attachments, while civil parties presented 48,731. Cardinal Becciu had faced formal charges of misuse of office. He took money, covert planning, messing around with witnesses. The prosecution asked for a 7-year prison sentence for the cardinal. Throughout the trial, Becciu repeatedly asserted his innocence and frequently blamed his departmental staff, citing lapses in his memory, and sought to pass responsibility for his actions to Pope Francis. They're trying to dismiss that. Don't dismiss it, though. And you'll see why. The trial had 86 hearings after it began more than 2 years ago, following the formal filing of charges against the 10 defendants and 4 connected companies on July 3rd, 2021. The prosecution filed a 500-page indictment following a sprawling 2-year investigation into the financial affairs of the Secretariat of State and officials and outside advisors connected to the Curial Department. That investigation was triggered in the summer of 2019 after senior leaders of the Secretariat of State, including Secretary of State Pietro Parolin, sought to pressure the Institute for Works of Religion, or the Vatican Bank, to grant a 150 million euro loan to the Secretariat. In addition to pressure from the Secretariat of State, the Vatican Bank president also testified in court that he was pressured to approve the loan by the Vatican's own supposedly independent financial watchdogs, to whom they initially flagged the request as suspicious. The bank's president testified that he was offered protection by the leaders of the Vatican Financial Information Authority if the bank waived through the application. The Pillar previously reported that the then president of the AIF, Rene Bruhart, had previously undisclosed contract with the Secretariat of State as an investment advisor, providing him with a second full salary to advise on the financial deals of the department which he was meant to be policing. End quote. So, quick recap. The Vatican Secretary of State wanted a loan for his office of 150 million euros on extremely favorable terms, and it was all shady, to put it mildly. The Vatican Secretary of State, by the way, is responsible for a lot of the foreign relations between the Vatican and elsewhere, as where your nuncios go. Remember that bit of information. It's important in a minute. The Secretary of State of Vatican City is Cardinal Pietro Parolin, who has lately been cited as a front runner for the papacy. In fact, in the last few days, as if they're floating his name just before this happened. And I kind of wonder what's going on there. And frankly, Pietro Parolin would make an absolutely terrible pope by most rational accounts, but he is considered a heavy favorite if a conclave were held in the near future. In fact, I've seen articles recently asking if he is really hungry for the papacy, if he's really working to become pope. That said, Cardinal Becciu has said he did nothing wrong, and that all the actions he took that ran afoul of the law were at the order of Francis, who conspicuously has been left out of this entire conversation, which is pretty typical. Now, the story is the latest in a long line of stories about Vatican finances that need to be understood in the context of these stories. For a good summary of the problems in the Vatican financing, I highly recommend, once again, you pick up Malachi Martin's book, Vatican, not Windswept House, Vatican, which should be read before you read Windswept House. It details the problems of Vatican City in this regard going back to the 1970s, where he uses the headlines of the day to paint a picture of deep rot in the Vatican that really was exposed after the council and leading into the 1990s. In fact, it actually begins in 1940s Italy. That book does. And it makes references to things that happened a century beforehand. The Vatican Bank has been at the heart of the various issues related to money. And since the post-war era, really that institution has been nothing but a problem for Rome, and has failed to really grasp that the church should handle its material finances in an entirely different way than it actually does. See, in the book Vatican, Father Martin suggests that it's because there was a secret bargain or pact that was made with the enemies of the church about financial matters a century prior to the events of that book, which would go a long way towards explaining the state of the church in our time, the rise of modernism, the infiltration of the church, everything that we talk about in this sphere of things. But there are pieces of this puzzle from Francis's reign we should focus on. Although I'm going to take a moment here and check the live chat just to see how things are going with everybody here. Will Conor McGregor become president? I would be surprised. Ireland's pretty far gone, but we'll see. And even then, I'm not going to opine whether or not he should become, because I'm not Irish, other than through some ancestry. Y'all figure out who should be running your country. I'm not going to. Let's see. Just checking the chat here. All right. As Nolo says in the chat, it's always money. It is always money, folks. It is always money. But let's just step back a few years. We'll begin by going with the late Cardinal George Pell. The Guardian published a piece that I will bring up on the screen here so you can see this, talking about Cardinal Pell. And this happened when suddenly he was freed. What seems like now a long time ago. They published this in 2020 after the late cardinal was freed from his obvious spurious charges that had been against him. They recount those accusations in sordid detail here, though, to undermine his credibility on what I'm about to recount to you. They asked him about Cardinal Becciu. Again, the investigation into Cardinal Becciu began 1 year prior, in 2019, to Cardinal Pell being asked about all of this. So let's go into the Guardian piece here. Quote, in the book, Pell makes repeated reference his 3 years at the Vatican trying to impose international accounting, budgeting, and transparency standards on the Holy See's notoriously siloed bureaucracy. That secretive culture has come under a microscope as Vatican prosecutors investigate the Vatican Secretariat of State's $350 million or Australian $568 million investment in a London real estate venture. I'm sure you remember that, as well as the movie Rocket Man and a few other things, and the tens of millions of euros in donations from the faithful that it paid to Italian middlemen to manage the deal. After more than a year of investigation, no one has been indicted. That's changed since then, though a handful of Vatican officials and Italian businessmen are under investigation. Pell said he was watching the developments as they unfolded. It just might be staggering incompetence, he said, of the scandal, adding that he hoped eventual trials would ascertain the truth. It would be better for the church if these things hadn't happened, if I wasn't vindicated in this way, he said. But given that they have happened, it's quite clear that the reforms he sought to impose were necessary. Pell clashed with other high-ranking Vatican officials in his role, including Cardinal Angelo Becciu, the Secretary of State. Pell claimed in 2014 that he had discovered hundreds of millions of dollars that were, quote, tucked away in particular sectional accounts and did not appear on the balance sheet, a reference to the Secretary of State's in-house asset portfolio that Becciu controlled that never appeared on the Vatican's consolidated financial statements. Becciu hasn't been charged in the corruption investigation. That's since been changed, obviously. But it came as a little surprise that Pell issued a blistering statement after Francis fired Becciu over apparently unrelated allegations of taking money that wasn't his, which Becciu denies. Pell congratulated Francis and then said, I hope the cleaning of the stables continues in both the Vatican and Victoria, a reference to his home state of Victoria, where he was initially hammered with things that he never actually did, and mostly, quote, it has been alleged that Cardinal Becciu, who would have had the financial means of influencing such things, used his influence to get certain figures in Australia to go after Cardinal Pell for things he certainly didn't do. Later, Cardinal Pell would pass away under really strange circumstances, and I'm sure that's just a coincidence as well. Pell is essential to this, but he's not the only one. Archbishop Viganò is also connected to all this. Now, you might be asking how. See, most people know that he was the papal nuncio, and they know him from his letters, but prior to being papal nuncio, Archbishop Viganò was the deputy governor of Vatican City, and it was his job to ferret out financial wrongdoing, to account for missing funds, and to balance the books. And he was very, very good at his job. So good at that job, in fact, that Benedict XVI sent him out of Vatican City to the United States to be the papal nuncio for his own protection, as it turns out. Let's hop into the Wayback Machine for this one, folks. You're gonna find this source that I am citing here odd, to say the least, because I don't usually use this secular outlet. But here we go. To NPR week, we are Vatican leaks raise questions over finances. March 29th of 2012. Okay, this is not anything new. So, the story comes from 2012, and yes, more than a decade ago, as you'll recall. A year or so before Benedict resigned from office, the story about the leak of information from inside the Vatican to the press, all sorts of problems in the Vatican occurred, and it was likely part of a coordinated effort to undermine Benedict XVI, and it worked too. I'm going to point out something to you. Point out something very important to you. In December of 2012, Benedict received a dossier detailing the rot in the church, and it is thought that that was the final thing that made him decide to resign. And this was March. Those are connected. Those are absolutely connected. Now, central to this story was Archbishop Viganò, who had a history of looking for people taking advantage of their posts in the Vatican to personally enrich themselves illicitly at the church's expense. The Vatican was deep in the red when he was given the post of deputy governor of Vatican City. And in a year, he took the finances of Vatican City from being deep in the red to running a nice, hefty surplus by simply finding out where all the money was going to places where it shouldn't go and putting them back where they should be going. Then the leaked documents from Vatican City happened. The NPR story gives us more. Quote, A television show in late January of 2012 on an independent network first revealed letters addressed last year to Pope Benedict XVI from the then Deputy Governor of Vatican City, Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò. Viganò complained of corruption within the church and protested orders to remove him from his post and send him to be papal nuncio or ambassador to Washington. Under Viganò's watch, the Holy See balance sheet went from $10 million in the red to almost $45 million in the black in just 12 months. By being kicked upstairs, Viganò wrote, his efforts to clean up the Vatican would be stopped and would also tarnish the pontiff's image by bringing into question his resolve to establish transparency inside the Vatican. The TV program later broadcast an interview with a man it said was a Vatican insider who had leaked some of the documents. The man whose face and voice were disguised said he was motivated by anger, quote, because there is complicity of silence in the Vatican to prevent the truth from coming out. Sound familiar? A second round of leaked documents focused on financial mismanagement. End quote. And that article goes on to describe how the Vatican laws were updated and things. And given that the article was written in 2012, the rest really isn't that relevant because the story didn't end there. Once Viganò was removed from the equation, issues began to arise. And this might also give you some insight into why he was handled the way he was by Francis. Remember, Viganò tried to bring a lot of this information and problems in the episcopate in the United States to Francis's attention in 2013 and in 2014. And if you recall, his concerns were completely dismissed. Some of the Francis defenders, the Pope splainers, like to say this is why Viganò, one of the reasons Viganò started writing letters, not for good reasons, but because he felt slighted personally and he was denied a red hat and all that. That's nonsense. Viganò had done his job, and it's very clear that the track record shows that he had been trying to do whatever job it was the Pope at the time wanted him to do. He was very good at doing it, and we are where we are now as a consequence. One thing I want to point out is that in the last 36 hours or so, because this is really weird, when the verdict was coming down against Cardinal Becciu for his wrongdoings, I began to notice some odd things going on around Viganò. You had heard rumors, because it came up in my chat yesterday in my live stream, that there were rumors being spread against Viganò on videos online and such, claiming that he had conditionally been reconsecrated a bishop by someone associated with the SSPX resistance, which would be odd if true, because Viganò just told Dr. Edward Mazza's conference that while we may suspect that Francis is an anti-pope, that we don't actually have the authority to declare him such, and then we have to wait for the church to rule on it. He said that at their conference via video barely a week ago, and that attitude is not generally the kind that is held by someone who is going to get conditionally reordained. Those who get conditionally reordained are either sedevacantists or people adjacent to them. Now, whether you agree with Viganò's statement about declaring Francis an anti-pope or not is immaterial to the topic at hand. It's just out of character for someone who would be getting conditionally reconsecrated by someone that many view as a renegade bishop. And that bishop doing this, that some view as a renegade, is Bishop Williamson. I don't view him as a renegade, but many do. The other thing that happened with that story that I found interesting is that at the same time this was happening, suddenly some online traditional Catholic figures decided to declare Viganò wrong on points of theology and such, in a move that, according to some observers, was meant to undermine Viganò's authority in the eyes of traditional Catholics. This is all happening at the same exact time that Cardinal Becciu is used as a fall guy in a decades-long problem in the Vatican that Viganò could speak out against if he decided he needed to. Not at this point anyone in the media aside from a few of us traditional Catholics would care what he said about the story, because clearly Viganò has been pushed to the side. And I checked with Archbishop Viganò's Twitter account and on Exsurge Domine. He hasn't said anything about the Becciu story as of the time that I'm streaming this video. There isn't a message there on Exsurge Domine, which is odd, but it's fine because talking about these things is Viganò's prerogative. But it's in the public record that Viganò was key to looking into the financial problems going on in Rome. So now I'm just curious what you have to say about all this. Are you surprised that Cardinal Pell was part of the story? Do you find it plausible that Cardinal Becciu had something to do with this as well? If so, why is Becciu allowing himself to basically be destroyed when he has that as an available option to make public? Could you imagine what would happen if it came out that Cardinal Becciu was responsible for the saga, the nightmare that Cardinal Pell went through, and they had done it on the order of Francis, or worse? Think about the consequences for Francis that would be if he had done that with Francis's approval. After all, Cardinal Becciu did say everything he did in his time in as the the second Secretary of State in the Vatican, was done at the order of Francis. That is the saga we're talking about here, folks. This isn't just Cardinal Becciu is the bad guy. This is a much bigger story, and no one is really talking about it. Ponto says he was getting too close, and they said, "Oops." I'm guessing that's around Cardinal Pell. Yeah, that's probably Cardinal Pell. I'm in the process of putting together something about an update on the story of the nuns that you're obliquely referencing, by the way, because an update to that just happened too. I'm curious what people think about this, though. Do you think that this story begins and ends with Cardinal Becciu, who will be now spending the next 5.5 years likely in a Vatican cell? And Harmony reminds us that love of money is the root of all evil. Is true. Money is just a tool. Money is like a hammer, right? It's just a tool. It's just something we use to do other things with. And when people misuse it, when people think too highly of it, it easily drifts into a form of idolatry. Harmony says also, let's continue to pray for Viganò. I agree. Mary says it's dangerous to be one of the good ones in Vatican. Absolutely. When did the Vatican leaks happen? 2012, right after Viganò was sent to be the papal nuncio, which I don't think is a coincidence. It says they got Pell the second time. A lot of us thought that was a little odd what happened to him, because he went through a routine medical procedure, and something that, at his age, any routine thing like that could be a problem, but everybody was surprised. Marion McCann says, as everything else, no consequences. Pretty much. So I'm curious what you have to say about this. If you have anything else to say, let me know in the comments, because we're going to wrap this up. As usual, I like to try to be kind of short on these things unless I have a guest on. I'm thinking I'm going to bring in a guest or something for, not on Christmas morning, but I'm going to reach out to some people to put some Christmas messages up on Christmas during a live stream. So let me know what you think about all of this. Not surprised is a McCarrick tactic. They sweep aside by using slander with a fall guy. Was he? It sounds like he was involved in this stuff, but who knows? They're going to appeal. So anyway, thanks for tuning in today, folks. I hope you enjoy your Gaudete Sunday. This is one of the most beautiful liturgies of the year if you're attending a high mass. So make the most of it today. And I have already live, will be in an hour, a good Gaudete Sunday reflection from St. Francis de Sales. So, folks, thanks for tuning in today. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.